It was 2:03 a.m. when the first alert hit federal investigators' dashboards. A nonprofit organization in Minnesota had just submitted a series of claims for feeding programs that were larger than the entire population of several counties combined, and the numbers kept multiplying as though reality itself had broken. Children were being counted in schools that did not exist, in districts that had never requested extra food, and invoices arrived with the efficiency of a Wall Street trading algorithm, flowing through the system with a speed that left analysts blinking at the screens, realizing immediately that something monstrous was afoot. Yet one critical detail remained hidden, one tiny thread that would unravel the entire operation if only it could be discovered. And before I tell you what that is, pause for a second and tell me where you are watching from right now, because scams like this do not care about city limits or state lines. And if you love scam-related stories that expose how ordinary people are turned into statistics for the greed of the cunning, subscribe to ScamSphere now so you do not miss what happens next, because this is a story that will make every federal alert, every audit, every whistleblower complaint feel like a thriller straight out of a Hollywood script. Feeding Our Future, the nonprofit at the center of the storm, had been awarded millions of federal funds meant for pandemic relief meals for children, money that should have purchased healthy breakfasts and lunches for struggling families. Yet the trail of invoices, shell companies, and bank accounts told a different story, one where luxury cars, exotic vacations, and high-end real estate were quietly purchased while seniors and children went without. And when investigators dug deeper, they found patterns so audacious that they could only have been designed by professionals who understood the vulnerabilities in the system, who knew precisely how to exploit the urgent need for federal pandemic relief, and who timed every transaction to avoid automatic oversight. In this sprawling web, administrators of the nonprofit created phantom schools, fictitious delivery routes, and ghost children, claiming hundreds of thousands of meals were delivered when in reality, trucks sat idle in parking lots. And invoices for food orders were forged to match the expected quantities. And the genius of this scheme lay not just in the fabrication, but in its theatrical attention to detail, with spreadsheets meticulously formatted, signatures digitally replicated, and auditors trained to expect chaos in pandemic conditions reassured that any anomalies were merely clerical errors, a perfect mask for billions in stolen aid. Meanwhile, inside the offices of federal oversight agencies, agents began to notice odd patterns, repeated addresses, bank accounts tied to shell corporations, and rapid fund transfers that could not be explained, all pointing to a calculated siphoning of public money. And as subpoenas were issued, investigators discovered that some of the nonprofit's directors were previously involved in smaller charity operations that had similarly collapsed under the weight of missing funds, suggesting a career of careful exploitation masked as service. And the scale of it was breathtaking, because every day, more children went without meals that were already paid for, benefits that vanished into offshore accounts before anyone noticed. And families waiting in line for food pantries would never know that their need had been weaponized to fund luxury lifestyles. One particularly striking detail was the use of multiple identities and corporate fronts, with dozens of LLCs registered under names of deceased individuals, minor children, and even stray animals, each designed to create layers of obfuscation between the stolen federal dollars and the perpetrators. And when federal investigators began tracing these accounts, they were met with dead ends in foreign banks, cryptic international wire transfers, and a level of sophistication that suggested a team with experience in financial crimes beyond the scope of traditional nonprofit fraud. And as the story unfolded, it became clear that the Feeding Our Future case was more than a single nonprofit gone rogue. It was a blueprint for large-scale exploitation, a cautionary tale of how desperation, oversight gaps, and greed can converge to create a perfect storm of fraud. In court documents later unsealed, prosecutors detailed how tens of millions of dollars intended to feed children were instead laundered through real estate purchases in Florida, luxury car leases, and offshore accounts. And investigators describe the atmosphere in the nonprofit's offices as almost surreal. With empty kitchens, unused trucks, and stacks of paperwork that looked legitimate enough to satisfy auditors, yet contained so many subtle falsifications that any competent forensic accountant would recognize them as the fingerprints of deliberate deceit. And in one instance, auditors discovered invoices for food deliveries in rural Minnesota listed at the cost of New York City catering. A difference so blatant it was almost humorous if the consequences were not so devastating. The human cost was equally horrifying, with children missing meals, schools reporting shortages, and families relying on pandemic relief programs left scrambling to fill gaps. And yet the people orchestrating the fraud moved through the system with impunity. Protected by a combination of digital sophistication, bureaucratic complexity, and a public trust that allowed nonprofits wide latitude in spending. The Feeding Our Future case eventually led to multiple indictments, including executives facing charges of wire fraud, mail fraud, and conspiracy to commit theft from the federal government. But the true story of this case lies not just in the court filings or dollar amounts, but in the audacity of the deception, the dramatic scale of the theft, and the chilling reality that such a scheme could operate during a national emergency, exploiting vulnerability and charity alike, and for the public. It stands as a reminder of how closely vigilance, oversight, and accountability must accompany generosity. Because even in the most well-intentioned programs, greed can find a way to turn aid into a personal fortune. The morning sun barely touched the streets of Minneapolis, but investigators were already awake, sifting through digital trails and physical evidence left behind by the Feeding Our Future nonprofit, a seemingly charitable organization that had become a masterclass in audacious fraud. And as they pieced together the scheme, the scale of the deception was almost incomprehensible. Millions of federal pandemic relief dollars intended to feed children had been diverted, often routed through complex layers of shell companies designed to obscure the origin and destination of funds, while trucks that were supposedly delivering meals sat idle in warehouses. Kitchens remained unused, and phantom schools and non-existent children were added to spreadsheets with almost artistic precision. A detail that was both horrifying and, in a darkly absurd way, impressive, because each fraudulent invoice, each falsified delivery log, was meticulously crafted to mimic reality so closely that even auditors trained to detect anomalies could be fooled at first glance. And investigators discovered that the people orchestrating this scam had studied the system with the precision of engineers, knowing exactly how to exploit gaps in federal oversight, the speed of pandemic relief, disbursements, and the limitations of digital monitoring, all while maintaining a facade of legitimate charity. The investigation revealed a network of employees, contractors, and corporate fronts who each had specialized roles. Some generated falsified shipping manifests, others verified non-existent deliveries, and a third group monitored auditors and automated checks to ensure that red flags never triggered a thorough review. And when investigators traced bank transfers, they found a labyrinth of accounts spanning the United States and extending into offshore jurisdictions, including shell companies registered in the Caribbean, corporate accounts in Florida, and anonymous digital wallets that moved millions with almost surgical efficiency. And the sophistication suggested not amateur scammers, but individuals who understood finance, accounting, and the psychology of oversight, who knew that public trust and bureaucratic complexity could be weaponized to create massive theft. And the FBI, the Department of Agriculture, and the Internal Revenue Service all collaborated on a months-long effort to untangle the web, conducting surveillance subpoenas, forensic accounting, and interviews with whistleblowers who had slowly realized that the nonprofit they worked for was not merely mismanaged, but actively diverting aid for personal enrichment, and the human cost of the fraud became painfully clear. While millions of dollars were siphoned off, children went without meals. Schools struggled to fill gaps in feeding programs, and families relying on federally funded relief programs found themselves abandoned. A cruel irony that emphasized the stark contrast between the perpetrators' luxury purchases and the communities left behind. And in court filings, prosecutors detailed specific expenditures: high-end vehicles leased in the names of shell companies, luxury condominium units in Florida, expensive international travel, and lifestyle spending that totaled tens of millions of dollars. Funds that had been intended to ensure children received adequate nutrition during a time of crisis, and yet, in the documents, the meticulousness of the fraud was almost staggering, with digital copies of invoices, timestamps, signatures, and bank reconciliations, crafted to withstand cursory scrutiny, a level of detail that underscored how deliberate and well-planned the scheme had been. And one of the most shocking revelations was the use of identities of deceased individuals and minors to set up corporate fronts, a technique that allowed transactions to proceed without immediate verification, because the auditors and federal systems assumed legitimacy, demonstrating that the scam relied not only on technical deception, but also on the manipulation of assumptions and trust inherent in public programs. The investigators also uncovered that the nonprofit had subcontracted certain operations to third-party vendors who were complicit, submitting falsified delivery confirmations, generating phantom shipping manifests, and providing fabricated documentation to satisfy reporting requirements, all coordinated in a manner that allowed the diversion of federal funds to occur at scale without raising early alarms. And the subcontractors often included small consulting firms, individuals with previous nonprofit experience, and digital specialists who understood how to craft believable documentation, creating layers of separation between the fraud and the people legally responsible on paper. A strategy that would later complicate prosecutions and asset recovery. And as federal agents dug deeper, they found internal communications where the organization's executives discussed methods to stay ahead of audits, cover tracks digitally, and maintain the story, demonstrating premeditation and an awareness of the illegality of their actions. And even the language used in these communications carried a disturbing casualness, as though the theft of tens of millions of federal dollars was simply part of doing business. Beyond the financial manipulations, the psychological impact was severe. Employees expressed guilt, fear, and confusion. Parents in schools reported missing deliveries, and auditors faced frustration at trying to reconcile the volumes reported with reality, often discovering discrepancies that could only be described as intentional. And in one particularly dramatic instance, a shipment of 10,000 meals allegedly delivered to a rural school district was never even prepared. Yet the invoice was submitted and approved, highlighting the absurdity and audacity of the scheme. A combination that made federal prosecutors describe the case as both startling in scope and almost cinematic in execution. And as arrests were made and indictments issued, multiple executives faced serious charges, including wire fraud, mail fraud, conspiracy to commit theft from the federal government, and money laundering, penalties that could involve decades of imprisonment and restitution obligations. And yet, despite the legal outcomes, investigators acknowledged that much of the stolen money could never be recovered because of the complexity of the offshore transfers, shell company dissolutions, and luxury purchases, a fact that emphasized the permanence of the damage and the ingenuity of the fraudsters. Meanwhile, financial analysts studying the case noted patterns reminiscent of organized crime operations, with highly compartmentalized teams, hierarchical coordination, and precise timing of transactions. An observation that blurred the line between nonprofit mismanagement and deliberate criminal enterprise. And as the full report emerged, the Feeding Our Future case became a benchmark in public administration circles for understanding the vulnerabilities of rapid dispersing emergency aid, illustrating how speed and trust can be exploited by those seeking personal gain. And the case spurred calls for stronger oversight, improved verification systems, and increased transparency in federally funded programs. Changes that experts warned would be necessary to prevent the next large-scale fraud. Because in the digital era, opportunities for exploitation multiply as oversight lags behind. And the Feeding Our Future case offered lessons both for policymakers and the public on the need for vigilance, accountability, and skepticism in the face of programs that, while designed for good, can be twisted into instruments of theft by those willing to manipulate every process. Ultimately, the story of Feeding Our Future is not only a tale of financial malfeasance, but a human drama combining greed, ingenuity, vulnerability, and consequence, illustrating how trust, charity, and urgency can be weaponized, and how a carefully orchestrated scheme can move millions across states and accounts while leaving communities deprived and families struggling to replace what was stolen. A narrative that reads like a dark thriller in real life, with suspense, audacity, and high stakes at every turn. And for viewers who follow ScamSphere, it stands as a warning and a fascination. A reminder that truth can be stranger, darker, and more thrilling than fiction. And if you thought this scam was thrilling, wait until you hear about the next one.